Hello and welcome to episode 180 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are wrapping up the CDL regular season. Of course, we've talked about Major Four of the last two episodes, but we haven't talked about the bottom four teams very much, and we would like to do so on today's episode. We want to talk about the teams that did not make champs that we will probably not be talking about very much at all over the next month or month and a half. But we want to give them time today. But before we get to any of that, how you doing, Bink?
Doing all right. Don't got a lot to preface here. Pretty tame early afternoon show for now, but I do think we got some good stuff to talk about, especially considering the teams we're talking about now didn't get to punch their ticket to champ, so we're not going to be seeing them in action for a while. So it gives us some time to talk about what they could do even before EWC or potentially what they do looking ahead the next year already. So excited to dive right in.
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about probably a few of these teams just in passing, but we haven't actually focused on them at all over the past few weeks because why would we when we're talking about LAT and FaZe and Optic and all these teams that we consider to be championship contenders. And obviously, if you're in the bottom four, you do not even get to be included in that because you are not even going to have a chance to play for a championship anymore. But we want to talk about these bottom four teams, those four teams being the Las Vegas Falcons, the Los Angeles Guerrillas M8, the Minnesota ROKKR, and Cloud9 New York. Those four teams finished in the bottom four and did not make champs. And I figured, it's probably best to go from worst to best, even though best is still not great in this category. But the worst, we talked about a ton this season in general, the Las Vegas Falcons. And I think we talked about them for good reason because we expected them to be the worst team in the league coming into the season. They were far worse than either of us could have imagined because they went 20 consecutive matches to start the season without a win. They started 0-20, and at one point, or I guess at a few points, we both kind of second guessed ourselves because we said at the beginning of the year, well, they're going to be really bad, but there's no way that they're not going to be able to win a single match. When you go 0-20 to start the year, I think there's good reason why we would, okay, maybe they might go the entire season. Fortunately for Vegas and their fans, they did win one match. They actually won 3 matches this season and finished with a 3-28 record, which I looked it up. I had to make sure. It was very close to the worst record in CDL history, but it is technically not.
Wow.
The Paris Legion,
Paris.
yeah. So Paris Legion in 2022 went 2-23, which so they have fewer losses, but also one less win. And what I was kind of going off of was the win percentage for these teams because of how different the number of matches can be season to season. So the Legion had an 8% win percentage in 2022, where Vegas had a 10%, a really high win percentage, I would say. So they went 3-28, 10% win percentage. In terms of maps, they were actually worse than the Paris Legion, if I remember correctly. I didn't write it down in the notes, but Vegas was 26-89 in maps, which was a 23% map win percentage, and I believe Paris was like 30% because they did lose a ton of game fives that season as well. And I looked it up, and I was actually doing this for Minnesota, but then I went back and I did it for all of the bottom four teams. The game 5 record for the Vegas Falcons was 40% win percentage. They went 2-3 this season. Their 2 of their 3 wins were in game 5. The only one, funnily enough, was against Optic. The first win was a 3-1 win, and then they won 3-2, I think, against Minnesota and who
beat Vancouver at the last major.
Yeah, in Vancouver.
I knew Vancouver and Optic. I didn't remember the Minnesota, but I do remember the Minnesota one now because that was during the hunt for champs, ironically.
Yeah. So Vegas, they win those 2 game 5s, but I just thought that was funny that of the bottom 4 teams, they had the second best map or game 5 win percentage. Um, where do you want to go from here with Vegas? Because this was the I mean, it was one of the worst seasons in CDL history. I don't know what you do necessarily if you're Vegas going into the off season. And something that you mentioned before we went on there was Esports World Cup being in Saudi Arabia. How does that affect what they do
Yeah.
next? So if you're Clayster or if you're whoever is running, the operation of the Vegas Falcons, what are you
And
looking to do? Yeah. What are you looking to do this off season?
yeah, I'll get to that Esports World Cup and
Yeah.
off-season stuff in a second. We can even circle back to that, but really, I do want to just like, kind of like you did, look at the season as a whole, and I do think it is important to pay attention to like really the two distinct halves of the season, even if they aren't, exactly a 50-50 split in the matches or whatnot, but like for lack of a better term, we had the all Saudi project and then the the
The regular project.
sure XNID plus NA players project, but then you can't even say NA because of Pred, but whatever. So like looking at it in those two ways, we, as you said, we very early on with the all Saudi project, we could have been very negative to start the season. But when they first started playing, it definitely did look like they had the potential to at least cause an upset. The thing holding them back, which obviously the stats back up, was the hard point. They could not win a hard point. They struggled in respawns, but there were moments from all the players, even the players who were quickly rotated out, like King Abadi, like it was very apparent early on that these players, it wasn't like, just recruit bots were being thrown into a lobby. Like these guys could shoot, and definitely like Kicks and XNID stood out above the others, but it gave, I don't think false hope is necessarily the right word, but it definitely like gave the impression that something could happen here with this team. And
Yeah.
by saying that, I don't mean like they're gonna win the major or win champs, but
They could win
it definitely
matches.
felt, I after seeing them play, it felt like they were going to actually win some series, and I did not think that beforehand. At the same time, one thought that I had when the roster was first announced, and um throughout the early portions of the season, was that especially it was the Luti um being released, or whatever that coaching change was. That was really the big turning point, I feel like, for this
Yeah.
the all Saudi project. But before that happened, like everything with Kicks and the first few roster moves where they brought players in that were also Saudi from their bench slash academy roster, it felt like they were going to stick with this all Saudi project for the long haul.
Hmm.
And we mentioned that numerous times. It didn't feel like they were going to pivot quickly. It felt like this whole season was going to go that direction for the All Saudi project. It felt like, um, at least to me, when we were comparing it with other Falcons esports teams where they have dropped the mega bag, allegedly, reportedly, for some high profile players, it felt like they were going away from that in this first year in the CDL, which is, end of the day, it is important to remember this is their first year in the CDL.
Yeah.
But it felt like they weren't going to take that, luxurious route of being a big spender, and they were going to try to make this all Saudi project work. And at the end of the day, that's, I think the main takeaway for me from this team is that I do think it's as I think it's very commendable that they wanted to try to make the all Saudi project work. I think they gave it probably more time than some other teams would have done if they were doing like region-based rosters that were struggling as
Yeah.
much as the team. But I also think at the same time it would have been very easy, even with the struggles, for them to continue to do the all Saudi project and just let it ride. A team like the Paris Legion, beforehand, if they were in a similar situation with like an all French roster and they were historically bad, and we know like the reportedly what their spending habits were and all that, it wouldn't have surprised me if they just like were like, oh, we don't care if we're 0-20 in hardpoint or whatever. Just
Mhm.
keep doing what you can, boys. So it really, as a whole, I think, it seems apparent that now that they went with the All Saudi project, didn't work. They quickly pivoted to this roster they have now, where they, at least the rumblings, and I haven't heard anything concrete, but it definitely, most people, and it could just be perception from those other the moves by Falcons and other esports, but it seems like most people think that Falcons just gave Pred the bag to come play for Vegas. That could be the direction they're heading in going forward. It also, they've kept Exnid on the team for this season, and I think he's played pretty well, especially given the circumstances and the constant changes around him. His first year playing at this level, playing overseas, or playing, in the CDL at the highest level. Um, so I think, going into next year, I wasn't gonna jump ahead in case you have anything to say, but yeah, go ahead if you got anything else.
I just think it's they deserve credit for trying something new
Mm-hmm.
for them. Uh, a Saudi player had never been in the CDL before this year, and now 7 Saudi players have been in the CDL as a result of the project that you mentioned. They started out with that all Saudi roster. They brought in 3 more players that were on their academy roster throughout the season, and then after Major 2, and shortly after Clayster replaced Luti as the head coach, then they go and they shift their focus. And uh, I think the Pred thing is probably true. Like they probably did drop a pretty big bag because for him, there's no reason for him to go to Vegas, at least this past season, unless it was either you get a lot of money now or it is, they told him, hey, like, you come here now and we can build around you in the off season, basically, like when we're able to compete for free agents. Because I'm sure Pred, like, even if it's a lot of money, like, he still wants to compete. So, there is kind of the push and pull of that, of the financial gain versus the competitiveness of a player like him that literally just won a world championship less than a year ago. So, um, if he's not on the roster next season, I think that's like, kind of disappointing unless they can build another roster that is up to par with a player like Pred being on your team. So I think it's going to be a pretty interesting offseason, all things considered, for Vegas. But I did want to talk about what you said about Esports World Cup, obviously, because that is something I hadn't even thought of. But what do you think? How do you think Esports World Cup could affect their plans, at least in the short term, for the roster?
Yeah, just to cap what you said there too on Pred. I mean,
Mm,
if they don't keep Pred, or Pred, I mean, maybe Pred gets an offer from another team that he can't turn down.
yeah.
But if we ever see a tweet like Pred is a free agent or anything, that should indicate, um, the type of deal that he signed with this team. And I would, if I see Pred tweets he's an unrestricted free agent after Esports World Cup, I would lean towards thinking Vegas didn't give him like a supermax contract. Maybe they gave him a little bit of a nice payday, but it might not be that generous bag that many people were thinking, and that could play a factor in the rest of their offseason moves. But going forward to what you said, yeah, the one thing that I've been thinking about really with this Vegas team, especially as it pertains to Esports World Cup, since they won't be at champs and they have time to practice. I saw I put it in the Discord, like Clay tweeted out sort of like his summary of
This season, yeah.
the first season. Yeah, and he said something about them taking a break or whatever. So don't know how long that's going to be, and don't know if that break will result in them deciding to make any roster changes with the current roster before Esports World Cup. um But the big question mark for me really with this Vegas roster is kicks. And all we know about Kicks' situation, at least as far as I remember, is that he went back home to Saudi Arabia early on in the season due to personal reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know if those issues or whatever is going on have been resolved and whatnot. But if they have, and he's in Saudi Arabia, he becomes a interesting option for this roster for Esports World Cup. A team with Pred, Kicks, Xnid, and then one of even Priesta or Arcides, or maybe another Saudi player or somebody else entirely. But that three, I'll say core three for lack of a better term, core three of Pred, Xnid, and Kicks, just based on the small sample size we saw of Kicks in his CDL debut, that's pretty interesting. And I think it would generate a lot of attention for the Saudi fans in attendance at the event and just up there. I mean, even non-Saudi fans who saw Kicks play early in the season and were able to just get a glimpse of what his potential could be. That could be just an exciting prospect or an exciting idea in terms of giving him another chance. It could also just be a thing where he's unable to play and it doesn't matter and we won't see him, and Vegas is going to show up to this event with Pred, Xnid, Priesta, and Arcides as the roster. So I do think that's an interesting idea. Just I don't know if anybody else has talked about it, or I haven't seen anything on Kicks really since the stuff going on early in the season. So I don't know how much is being said about if it's even a possibility. But that's just something that came to mind to me, and I think it would be kind of cool to see him back in the fray, just based on the small sample size and the taste of what he was able to produce in his brief sample size early in the season.
I didn't really think about him for EWC, but I definitely had him in mind for next season because he did show a lot of promise in the very short time that he had in the CDL. He probably showed the most promise of any of these Saudi players, Xnid included, even though Xnid definitely toward the end of the season got a lot more, I guess, more respect in terms
Yeah.
of like him as a legitimate Call of Duty League player. But yeah, that's like a big question is like, what is his status? What does the future hold for him? And another part of it is just how important is the Saudi representation aspect in general? Like, does there need to be like one Saudi player on this team moving forward, regardless of who else is on the team? Or, what if they go into a season, are they going to be like, well, this has to be half Saudi? Like, what is the goal here? Is it to actually have Saudi representation on your team, or is it to put together the best team regardless of nationality and background? I think we'll probably learn that pretty quickly
Yeah.
because EWC will probably be the test, at least the first test.
I would be surprised if they completely scrapped any Saudi representation for
Yeah.
um just for lack of a better example I can come up to. It feels like Xnet is going to be Vegas's Snoopy, what
Yeah.
Snoopy is to Boston. Um, yeah, I actually don't know how young Xnet is. I don't think he's super young, but I don't think he's old. Um, but either it feels like he's like this guy that they gave his first chance to, and they're gonna see what he's capable of, and 1 year might not be enough of a sample size, so they're gonna stick with him. Could be completely off here, and we could be looking at 4 NA players on Vegas if they do go down the route that we've seen the organization do in other esports. But my gut feeling right now is that Xnid, if you had to ask me right now what I think Vegas's roster is going to look like next year for the CDL, even beyond Esports World Cup, I mean, unless there's something catastrophic that happens there and they just like don't even win a map and they decide to blow it up completely. Outside of that, I think team of two, Pred and Xnid, and then those other two spots could be NA players, could be Kicks and one NA player. I mean, could be an EU player if they, someone like Afro even they could maybe give him a chance just because he's played well in challengers this year. I don't know, but I would be surprised if they didn't build around Pred and Kicks, or sorry, Pred and Xnid, and that is also contingent upon Pred's contract situation, which we don't really know. So there are questions around Vegas, but I think it's one of the teams that I'm more interested in to see exactly what they do in the offseason. Some of these other teams we're going to talk about, even in this show, like they could literally do anything. And I'm just like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's something they can do. But I think just the fact that there are multiple directions I could see this team going in based on what they have here has me a little excited about what Vegas could do.
According to Gamepedia, Xned's been with the Falcons organization since 2021, February
Okay.
21. So, I mean, I think in general they like him. They
Yeah.
probably are pretty committed to him. He's 22, so basically since he's been eligible to compete in Challengers or the CDL, he's been with this organization. So I think that's probably a good sign that if there is going to be Saudi representation, I do agree with you that there probably will be one player at the very least. Xned probably will be that player, like unless Kicks is able to come back and they really have confidence that he's going to be able to make an impact. But the last point you made of like this team has so many different avenues they could go on. Like there's not they don't feel limited like some of these other teams do in like what moves they can make, and it's because of the money. Like the fact that we've
Yeah.
heard, they spent reportedly millions of dollars for a single Counter-Strike player. They've done this multiple times where they have gotten big name players or big name coaches to sign with the Falcons, or they've acquired them in some way. And if they can do that, or if they do that, I guess, because I think they can, but if they want to do that in the CDL, then that changes kind of the landscape of the entire league. Because right now, we have Optic is by far the most popular, and I think they have the advantage in terms of that popularity and also money. But like I think the popularity might be even more important to a lot of these players, because like if you could also just look at it as like I'm going to make more money as a result of being with Optic, even if I don't sign the biggest contract with Optic to start. Because I'll have the streamer the stream numbers. Shotzi has thousands of viewers every time he goes live, in large part because he's with Optic and he's been with Optic for several years. So there's that. But we also have FaZe and LAT. We'll see what happens with C9. Like in general, like they're of the brands in the
Yeah.
CDL, they're among the biggest, but that didn't play out this year, I would say. But other than that, like they're I don't know what the salary numbers are either with those teams. So like maybe they're able to, and I want to just go through this real quick because I have this for every team, keep or cut, and I listed the last roster that they fielded in the season plus their head coach. So for Vegas, it's Xned, Pred, Arcees, Priesta, and Clayster because he replaced Luti during the season. I love Clay, so I'm probably not gonna get rid of him. Also, he had his first year as a coach. He wasn't the head coach to start. I don't know if he had this in mind or necessarily even what he had in mind in terms of a roster. So who knows where they go? I would say probably just run it back with Clay. I made it clear how I feel about Arcees and Priesta coming into this roster. It felt like they just needed some like CDL or like high challengers level talent to fill out this roster, and it probably does feel like Pred and Xnid are the two players that they keep, and then the other two. Let's be honest, like if they're willing to spend, they can get pretty much anybody, right? Like they could. It's going to be probably hard to pry away Shotzi or Dashy from Optic, for example. And I don't know what the situation with them and Pred is, but there are players on Optic and players on FaZe, or even players on LAT, even if they end up winning champs, where it might be in their benefit, their financial benefit and competitive benefit to go to Vegas next season. What do you think if you're Dens, like keeper cut of those players? Do you kind of agree with what I'm saying there?
Yeah, keeper cut. We're keeping Clay. If it's me right now, I'm keeping Pred and keeping Xnit if I can, and then cutting Priesta and cutting Arcides. Um, I think highly of Arcides and Priesta, but I think, especially with the purported resources that Vegas have they can go down multiple different directions, whether it's just inserting kicks and then getting one high profile free agent to play alongside them, or going after two high profile free agents. I mean, even someone like Sib, we're going to talk about
Yep.
C9 in a little bit. Like Sib and Pred have worked together on Seattle Surge back when, a couple years ago when they were first coming up. C9 didn't have the best year this year. Maybe C9 wants to build around Sib. We'll talk about that in a bit, but maybe Sib gets to explore his options. And, that's of like the potential AR players that could be available. Sib is a slam dunk upgrade over what we've seen from Priesta and Arcides, in my opinion. So, um, yeah, for keeper cut, I'm keeping Pred and Exnid, cutting Priesta and Arcides, and we'll keep Clay if we're throwing that in too.
We'll keep moving along. 11th place in the CDL this season. The LA Guerrillas mate the first season with GentleMates being involved in the organization. There was so much, like we didn't even know if this team was going to be here for this season because the Guerrillas seemed to be kind of phasing out of esports. The Guard being the esports organization, they laid off pretty much everybody, but then they stuck around for another season and a half. It felt like, and so there was a lot of questions about if this was actually going to happen. GentleMates comes in right before the season. They announced that instead of it being the LA Guerrillas like it had been since the inception of the Call of Duty League, is going to be the LA Guerrillas mate. And it seemed like GentleMates were in charge of what was going on this season anyway. They brought in Linz, who had like a pretty promising rookie season previously, a French player, GentleMates being a French organization run by Gotaga, by far the most popular and most famous French Call of Duty player of all time, and one of the most, well, he's probably the most popular. I don't know, probably not the best. But certainly, I think we've said it before. He's like French Nade Shot, essentially, in that world, and he's kind of at the top of GentleMates. It did not work out, let's say. This was one of the worst seasons in CDL history, which it was amazing that we got two of these teams in the same season, which has not happened previously. I looked it up. LAG, this was the fourth worst season since the Call of Duty League started in 2020. They were only better than the 2022 Paris Legion, which we talked about earlier, the 2025 Vegas Falcons, and last year's Boston Breach team, which got a lot of buzz the entire year. And I should say the Breach were, not that much worse in terms of record than this LAG team. But because Vegas was so bad this year, LAG did not get nearly as much attention for how bad they truly were. So they finished 11th place in the league with 55 CDL points. They went 6-26, which was a 19% win percentage. And in terms of maps, they went 42-82 for 34% map win percentage. So really, really bad, obviously. They made some really baffling decisions, I would say, this season with their roster. Part of it was like a push and pull, it seemed like, with Linz, because he was not performing nearly up to expectation, but he stuck in the roster for a while. And there were rumors, or there were, I guess, accusations that he was only being kept there because he was French and that it wasn't anything to do with his skill, which I thought he was pretty skilled coming in. I had pretty high hopes for him, but it obviously did not pan out for him. It did not pan out for this roster. And they eventually replaced him, I believe, before the Major 3 qualifiers, if I'm not mistaken. Or maybe it was...
Sounds right.
Yeah, I think it was the Major 3 qualifiers. They bring in Fellow and Ojani to finish out the season with Kismet and Lunars. But yeah, just some really head-scratching decisions. I know D-Real, the head coach of LAG, he posted a week or two ago a long thread about how he takes responsibility for the season and that he should have done better and that the players did a great job for the situation that they were put in. But I like D-Real, and he's obviously a world championship coach. This was not his greatest season either. I just look at the roster changes, and that's what really kind of was like, it stuck out. Like, because you could talk yourself into. I thought bringing Priesta in was a mistake to start the season. I I think I said that at the beginning of the season, but if not, I did feel like trying to run it back with this NYSL team like was good, except Priesta probably was not the guy to go with. So they went Kismet, Linz, Priesta, and Skies to start the season. And then at some point they say, all right, this isn't working. They take out Priesta, they bench him, they bring in Lunars. 10 days later, they bench Skies for Priesta, and then eventually they make the roster change where they bring in Fellow, who was Lunar's Challenger's teammate at the beginning of the year, and someone that we thought should get bumped up with Lunars as well, because then it would help bring this rookie player along and help him kind of acclimate. Instead, they kind of do this disjointed roster change, bring in Fellow and Ojani to end the season, and it doesn't work. Like, none of it really worked. If you look at the full season stats, you look at the season stats with just the last roster that they had, they're almost identical, except they were far worse in control with this latest roster, and they eventually only win 6 matches this season. What did you think about LAG's roster in totality? Even though we did not give them enough grief, I think, throughout the season for it.
Yeah, so first things first, hopefully this is the one and only season where we have the monstrosity of a name that is LA Guerrillas GentleMates or
Yes.
whatever. Hopefully that's just
Please.
LAG is done and dusted and we get GentleMates. I don't know how they're gonna do it. Maybe it's just LA GentleMates and then technically that's LAG, but
Yeah, there we go.
know,
We're good.
I don't know what we're gonna do from that perspective. But whole season perspective, I guess, for this team is I do think early on, I remember like when they had their struggles initially in the season, I definitely felt like Linz was performing well. I just remember a couple of hard points off the top of my head where they, he was leading the slaying category and he was doing his job, and because that was the narrative I was focused on for this GentleMates team coming into the season, was it was the NYSL team with Linz in place of Hydra. Can Linz fill Hydra's shoes? And we both were, I believe, of the idea that like, no, Linz isn't Hydra, but like if he can come anywhere close to doing what Hydra was doing on the map, this team could find success. And it felt like, immediately right out the gate, Linz was showing potential to, at least fill that role somewhat adequately. And he was doing well, and it felt like they were losing game fives and losing S&Ds, which just didn't make sense for the team that we saw. And obviously they had Sender at the time when they were on NYSL winning the world championship, so maybe that was a big factor in the difference between S&D gameplay and whatnot. But early on, that's I definitely want to at least mention that I felt like Linz was playing well initially. The thing that really stood out to me for this GentleMates team, and we do have to give some credit where credit is due, Lunars was one of the top names that most people in the community were talking about very early on. Well, the first name being thrown around in the challenger scene this year was Hook. Hook was like, everyone was talking about him. Obviously, the Pred situation happens, and Optic, snatches him up very quickly. I don't think that was on anybody's radar. A lot of people thought Hook was going to be the first player from Challengers picked up based on his, rapid success he saw very, very early in the Challenger season. But after Hook, I feel like Lunars was like the number 2 name that was being discussed very heavily. Maybe you throw Neptune in there before that, but I feel like Lunars, maybe it's just like from an AR versus SMG perspective. So I'll at least say I feel like Lunars was the top AR challengers candidate or prospect based on early season results in challengers this year. And GentleMates did a good job identifying that they needed to make a roster change, and they gave him a chance. What I didn't agree with and I thought was weird was the whole like tango or whatever, however you phrased it early on, where they bring Lunars in for Priesta, then very quickly bring Priesta back in for Skies. I thought that was a little weird, and it just felt like, you were the one advocating for, if you're going to do that, just bring Fellow and Lunars in together and move on from Priesta and Skies completely. Obviously, that doesn't happen till later in the season, but that like just that instance of the they did a good job identifying Lunars as a prospect they wanted to bring into the team, but then I don't want to say it's like second guessing, but like the the quick roster change after that of bringing Priesta back in and getting rid of Skies, that didn't like fit with like if I'm grading it, I feel like I give them an A for identifying Lunars as someone they wanted to bring in. Obviously they didn't get the results with him, but like the identifying they want to make that move, targeting him, and actually signing him to the squad, they did a good job there. But then that little roster shuffle after that with Priestess Skies, that just didn't
It
that
doesn't
seemed off
fit.
to me, and maybe it's some behind the scenes stuff, like it just wasn't working with the comms, or it wasn't working chemistry wise. I don't know, but even then, it felt like it was very short. Um, they gave that initial roster with Lunars, Skies, Kismet, and Lynn's a very, short leash, and that felt weird to me. So I don't know what happened exactly there, but that's kind of how I look at this GentleMate season. Is there are um some glimpses of hope, or just some specks, or whatever the phrase is, like you see something in the endless void. There's some tiny specks of light in there and whatnot. Like even with this recent roster, Johnny has had some moments where he's played well. Kismet's been basically a rock most of this season. He's done what Kismet has done historically. Like he can be 99 Kiz at times, but if when he's not 99 Kiz, it looks different when he's not 99 Kiz if Hydra's next to him, as opposed to some of these other players that he was playing alongside this year. So I just think overall there really were, some moments that GentleMates, like that there's something to, it's not all doom and gloom for this team. And another thing just completely didn't even mention here is really the fans that GentleMates brought in. We've talked about the viewers on other um episodes and whatnot, like some of their matches were some of the top viewed matches, even for a team that wasn't playing well this year. So what does that look like for GentleMates if they continue to compete in the CDL and they get a team that actually is competitive? Um, that's something to keep in mind. And the other thing alongside the fans that still sticks out to me is after Major 1, when that GentleMates team lost, that event was in Barcelona, Spain, whatever,
Yeah.
or Madrid, I don't remember. It was in Spain. They had like that huge, like not like a meet and greet, but it was like a huge circle of fans, and the GentleMates team like walked out into them, and they're all cheering them as they literally got a top 12 placing. It's like
Yeah.
those fans were like, that was really cool to see. So in totality, I don't, it's from a results perspective, GentleMates did not have the season they obviously wanted,
Of
but
course.
there are some things that they could look to moving forward. It's not, all doom and gloom in my eyes, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's, they completely blow up this roster and we see something totally different in 2026.
Yeah, they it's just my thing right now is the last point that you made about them being a really popular team, especially with the French crowd, bringing in these fans that I think have been largely alienated over the last 5 years because of the CDL. Like, Vitality pre CDL was the team for French fans. Like that was, we. I remember like Gfinity, like the first Gfinity events, like that was very cool. Obviously, Esports World Cup, like pre-Saudi. It was in Paris, I want to say, and obviously the French fans were crazy there. It was a cool atmosphere, and I feel like those fans just have not been served properly for a long time. And this is probably the best chance to do so because the Paris Legion just completely just ignored them. Essentially, they had one French player, Brezi. He never played that entire season in 2020. So like they basically had an Australian roster for the French team, which was it just didn't fit. And now you have Gotaga, and he's the most popular player in the country. He owns the organization. He's the face of GentleMates. This is the chance for and for the CDL. I'm sure they're like, we want this to work. We do
Yeah,
not want them to screw this up. We don't want to be in a situation where we look back in 2 to 3 years and we're like, wow, like we have no French fans for Call of Duty anymore because LAG was a complete disaster this entire time. So the CDL is probably not going to say that, but they're probably very much pulling for LAG to figure it out. That also brings me to, does Lens get another opportunity next season? Because this season was just kind of a disaster from the get go. It felt like they had a lot of potential. I thought they would be way better. Obviously, I was not expecting them to have the fourth worst season in CDL history, but at the same point, like, can you even bring him back? It will your fans be like, what the hell are we doing? Why are we bringing a guy back that was benched? And I should note, he is not released, if I'm not mistaken. He is benched. So like, they released all these other guys, they released Skies, they released Priesta, they did not release Lins. I think that might be pretty telling to how they feel about him and what the future looks like for him, because I would not be surprised if he's back with LAG, if it's Gorillas mate, if it's LA Gentlemates, whatever it is. I would not be surprised if he is on this roster in 2026. That brings me to the next point, and that's the keeper cut. Kismet,
yep.
Fellow, Lunars, Ojani, and D Real. I think D Real has the championship pedigree. There aren't many head coaches that have a world championship under their belt, so I would probably keep him. If I could, I would definitely keep Kismet. He's all these other players, like if you had to pick one, I'm keeping Kiz because I believe that he can be the for a championship run. I think he can be the best player. At the worst, he's going to be your second best player, and I don't think you can really say that about Fellow, Lunars, and or Ojani. But I see the point of, they brought Lunars in. Was it really just for one season, right? Like, it when you bring a young guy in who's never played in the CDL, he's not this 18-year-old phenom like Hydra was with NYSL, where they knew exactly, like, he's gonna be a difference maker year one. I don't know, like LAG, did they really bring in Lunars, and are they gonna give up on him essentially after not even a full season because he didn't get the full year? That would seem weird. So if I'm LAG, I probably keep Kiz and Lunars and then Andy Real. But what do you think?
I think they completely blow it up, in my opinion. Not including Lens here. I wouldn't be surprised if Lens gets another chance or remains on the team, even in a bench capacity.
Yeah,
Um, love Kismet. I think if they do keep anybody from this team, I would say keep Kismet, but I think he can go to another team. And kind of like I was just saying there, like, yeah, we know what the Bulldog's capable of when he's in 99 kids mode, but he really obviously shined his best when he was playing alongside Hydra. So if he gets the opportunity to go to another team where he doesn't have to be the number one SMG, he can be that number two SMG alongside a superstar SMG. I think that's the best move for Kismet going forward. Um, I do think, unfortunately, it feels like just with um, the results from this year and whatnot, I feel like Lunars is going to find himself back in challengers
yeah.
to start next season. Obviously, and could be a situation where he goes back to challengers and fries at the start of the year again, and then he's right back in the same situation next year and gets another opportunity. But yeah, I don't think maybe Johnny and Lunars get a shot from some of these other teams. I would be surprised if they're on GentleMates or whatever this team is going to be called next year going forward. I think this squad completely blows it up. They do have Marky B on the coaching staff too, so I agree with you there. They keep the coaching staff intact,
It's a good coaching
build a new
staff.
squad. Yeah. The interesting name, I mentioned it when we were even talking about you know, going back to Vancouver, even, well, Vancouver wasn't an option, but I just know around that time talking about options, that the one name that I feel like always comes back up in terms of players who haven't gotten a chance but have that French tie is Cobra. Um, so, I don't know exactly how his season has gone this year in Challengers, but it's possible that maybe they give him a shot finally, and we see what he's capable of. Cobra played with Brezzy, Linz, and Abuza. And if we know anything, I know Abuza's not French, he's Belgium, but maybe that's still like an attractive option for GentleMates. And
Yeah.
maybe, depending on him, Vancouver does at champs, maybe he moves on and goes somewhere else. But um I don't think Brezzy gets another shot in the CDL. He could for all I know, but I do think, again, that is an interesting element to the gentlemate situation. They could go all French team. We saw how the all Saudi project worked. I don't think it'd be to the same level, but they could go that direction. They could go the direction of what we think Vegas is doing now with like one French player and
Yeah.
then surrounding it with other EU talent even. Or they could just go with, screw the French identity and just give us the four best players we can get. Um, so that is an interesting element to see what Gentlemates do. But I do think in terms of the keeper cut, I think they're blowing up the roster, starting fresh. They'll keep the coaching staff, and we'll see what this squad and even what the name is next year.
So Cobra is on Project 7 White. They will be at Challengers Finals. I think they finished second in the European points standing, so that's how they qualified. He finished top 6 at the Dallas Open with Brezzy, Aspect, and Vortex. And then same roster finished top 12 at Miami. And then at DreamHack, they finished top 12. Brezzy was not on the team, but Denzo was. So a few pretty recognizable names. Vortex probably being the most recognizable of
Yeah.
the group. Former Epsilon guy, if I'm not mistaken,
Yep.
which is probably not something he likes to be associated with all the time. But yeah, I think it probably is going to be a similar situation to Vegas, where Linz or some kind of French or French speaking representation probably is the best way to look at it, is probably on this roster. I thought about Kismet, and like if LAT were not to win champs, they would be an interesting party, because just theoretically he could replace Envoy next season. Even though I'm not talking anything bad about Envoy, I think he's a really good player. I don't think it would be fair necessarily, but we've seen that happen before, where coming up short at the end of the season, especially if you're a highly touted roster like LAT, this is something like FaZe has done a few times, where there's one guy that gets cut, and he's definitely, of those four, the most vulnerable if they don't perform. But Kiz is probably going to have a lot of interest around the league, I would imagine. So there's no guarantee that it would be LAT anyway. But yeah, he's a great player. Like it feels like you're really losing something if you don't have that kind of he's a winning player. Like that's really what it comes down to. I think he just helps you so much in terms of like a winning culture. And that could really help if you are going to have young guys that really haven't done anything in the CDL. I think that is especially important for them. But yeah, the only other real thing was D-Real was, kind of instrumental in that rebuild that NYSL had. It's a weird rebuild because it was so toxic at NYSL in 2022. Even though they were very good at the end of the season, like talent wise, they could stack up with some really good teams, but just the culture was so rotten that they had to rebuild in 2023. And of course they won champs. Do you see any similarities between that and what LAG face right now, or is it just a completely different landscape for them?
Well, we haven't heard anything on the toxicity front, so
Yeah.
I don't know if that's similar. And it's also like that was a situation where it's either you build around Hydra or you build around Krim, and I think Krim at the end of his career, notably. Um, I think all things considered, obviously they get a world championship after that. It worked out in the end, but I don't think that situation is similar right now, because I really don't, like I like Kiz, I like 99 Kiz, and what he's capable of, but I just don't know if there's that one guy that this team builds around. And maybe they've seen enough from Johnny and they think they can build around him, or maybe even Lunars. Maybe they do think highly of those guys and they're like, okay, we're going to keep one of you guys and get three more guys around you. I just don't see that being the route they go down. And especially with the French affiliation and whatnot, I tend to think they're going to have at least one French player on their team next year, but we'll have to wait and see.
Cloud9 New York is our next team. They finished in 10th place this year with 125 points. Their record 12 and 24, 33% win percentage, 42% map win percentage, 57 and 80 on the season. They only had this most recent roster for part of the Major 4 qualifiers and Major 4. They went 2-5 with this new roster. They were we'll talk about it because I actually have a segment I think in mind for our award show. But they're certainly pretty disappointing on the year. They were coming in, obviously. This is the core of the team to start the year. Attach, Crimp, Mac, and Sib. Obviously, there's a lot of Seattle Surge hangover from there because Mac and Sib played together. Accuracy comes in as the head coach. So that is the bulk of the Surge roster. You bring in Attach, who is obviously one of the better AR players coming into this season. Crimp had a really strong year with LAT last year. So there's a lot to like about what C9 built. And then it just immediately falls apart. They finish 11th in the Major 1 qualifiers. They never have a major placing above top 8, so they are top 6, excuse me. They finished top 6 at Major 2, so they never really make it even to Championship Sunday at any of these events. The major qualifiers, they only start in the winners bracket 2 of the 4 times, which is not something that I certainly expected from this team coming in. What went wrong for C9 this year?
Well, we got it on the notes here too to talk about it, but really the thing right from the start that impacted this team, and we'll never know for sure how much of a impact it actually had, but it seemingly from the outside looking in had a pretty big impact, is the fact that the team was competing from LA, or competing from Cali. And they notably had some serious online issues or server issues, ping issues, whatever the case may be, early in the season, and that just put them, put their backs against the wall very early in the season. Well, while we haven't talked directly about Carolina in a couple episodes now, they're like the inverse of Cloud9, where Carolina got off to a hot start and they were able to still qualify for champs despite their very serious struggles at the end of the season because of their hot start. On the other hand, Cloud9 got off to a rough start, had some moments here or there throughout the season, but never, like you said, never had a really strong placing at these lands. And they were just never able to dig themselves out of the hole that they dug for themselves very early on. And that's really, what sticks out for me for this Cloud9 roster is like it felt like they had the potential to be a team like in that 5 through 8 or even like a 5 through 6 situation, just from a talent perspective. Thought they had I thought they had a chance to make something happen there, and it just it never came to be. And now Attach is retired. We already talked about that. I really don't know what Cloud9 does from here. Maybe the Esports World Cup is a really big opportunity for the guys on this team. Notably, I kind of talked about Sib when we were talking about Vegas. I think Sib has shown what he's capable of over the years, and really, if he wants to stay with Cloud9, he probably will. If he gets offers from these other teams, I wouldn't be surprised if he goes elsewhere. These other 3 guys, though, Kremp, Spartan Capital. This is really, especially for Spartan Capital coming in late in the season, EWC is going to be a big opportunity for them to showcase their talent and showcase what they're capable of and whether they are or aren't deserving of a CDL spot in 2026. At the same time, I think, circling all the way back to last year when Cloud9 enters competitive Call of Duty, returns to competitive Call of Duty for Esports World Cup. I think they thought they were going to have that Hydra roster, and it is noteworthy that Sib announced at one point he was a restricted free agent, and it felt like Cloud9 was going to have the roster of Hydra, Kismet, Skies, and then +1.
Yeah.
And then the whole LAT super team stuff happens, and they pivot to going from Sib being a free agent to building around Sib. And for those who, aren't as in tune with what Cloud9 does in other esports, I'm not like, a Cloud9 expert or anything, but, based on what I've heard from, other C9 fans over the years and like League of Legends and stuff, and, saw with like Perks, for example, a big European League of Legends player who came over to Cloud9 for 1 year. C9 Jack, the owner, CEO, whatever, the guy in charge for Cloud9, he tends to side with doing what the players want and giving them some freedom in choices in terms of like team changes and whatnot. So it could be a situation here where they decide to keep Sib and build around him. Maybe they decide that, some of these other guys at EWC, they want to build around them. Sib gets an offer elsewhere and he moves on. I don't know, but C9 is just one of those brands, kind of like you were mentioning early on, like, you got Optic, LAT, and FaZe. Those are the big three, brand-wise, fandom-wise, all that. I think Cloud9 has the potential to really enter that upper echelon just with the brand it's built in the esports space in general, if it gets the right team together. So I do think, for the keeper cut or whatever, I really do think Cloud9's in a situation where they're going to blow it up. I could, again, see them building around one of these guys that they have on the team currently, and this could all change depending on how they do at EWC, because I do think this team has a chance to do well at EWC. Just, again, in the small time that this 4 squad has been together, they've shown they've been able to do well in search and destroy, which is, always something that sticks out to me. And especially in a tournament like EWC where they're going to be playing against some challengers teams and whatnot, if you're got good fundamentals in search, that could serve you in a tournament like this. So I do think the direction of Cloud9 could hinge a little bit more than some of these other teams based on how they do at EWC. But I definitely think Sib probably goes elsewhere if he does get the opportunity to, or he will, stay here and they build around him. But I for the most part think this squad is gonna look very different in 2026.
I agree. I think keeper probably cut all of them, maybe keep accuracy as the head coach, but like everybody else is probably gone and you completely rebuild. And it's not like in traditional sports where you have to go through the draft and you have to do this and that. Like they could be a championship contender next year if, and this goes into the next point, is if they spend big on free agents.
Yeah.
And like you said, in other esports, they have proven that they are willing to do that and they're able to do that. We'll see if that actually works out in the CDL. And if, it all kind of ties together, because if Vegas also decides to spend big, and then you have Optic and FaZe and LAT all trying to, at the very least, retain their roster, who knows what that actually entails, what that will result in. But I think it could be really interesting. And I just think this offseason will be pretty eye-opening in a way, or I guess it'll kind of give us an idea of what C9 is actually going to look like in the CDL, because last year was not a normal offseason for them. They come in right at the beginning, but like around EWC, and then and they have this roster, like you said, and it completely falls apart because Hydra wants to leave and go to LAT, and the LAT super team is formed and all that. Kismet ends up leaving, Skies ends up leaving, I think it's just a really weird season or off season for them, and I'm sure they will now uh, probably be pretty normal. I would imagine this year, like whatever the normal is for C9, I imagine we'll see it this year. Um, but yeah, I would probably tear it all down, and I think a part of it is like how much will LA play into free agents' decisions? Like,
Yes, that is definitely important.
will these players even like even aside from the competitive disadvantage, which it does seem like they are putting themselves at a disadvantage, and that would be pretty frustrating in general. But a lot of these players have kind of built lives in the Dallas Fort Worth area, or if you're one of the Atlanta FaZe guys, like those guys live in Atlanta, and that they've done that for several years now. The Toronto Ultra guys have been living in Toronto for a while, or at least like Kleenex and Insight have. So like, will these players be willing to move to LA to live there? Um, or how much would it cost? Or I guess how much more would it cost to get those free agents to go to LA instead of Dallas or one of these other locations? I think that might be an interesting look into this offseason if they're not able to land some of the big fish that you would expect an
Yeah.
organization like C9 to land. I do wonder if that'll have anything to do with just being in LA in general. So
No, I think that's a huge factor because like Cloud9 it is if it's not been a year yet, it's close to a year since their return to Call of Duty. They you know they didn't return just to come in for 1 year, struggle, and then leave. Like they you know
mhm.
at least seemingly from the outside looking in, they're here to compete for the long haul and they want to win. Um, but the factor of LA, I said it early on in the season when you got a veteran like attach, like it felt like, just based on what my understanding of C9 Jack and what he's done with other teams, I understand the whole like they want the C9 organization all close knit. They do like morning workouts and stuff in their community and whatnot. But like when you got a veteran like Attach who's won world championship, been competing for over a decade, like if he sat down with Jack and was like, look, like I get the LA, the Cali thing, but like this just isn't working out and it's really hurting us as a squad. Can we just go compete in Dallas for the season? We'll be back in Cali, like, intermittently or whatnot. I feel like they could have sat down and had that conversation and maybe worked something out. I don't know if there's any player this offseason that Cloud9 realistically can get who has that same sort of like, you know, veteran appeal or like the same. I don't think leverage is the right word, but like when I think of like what attached joining this team, like I outside of someone like Slasher or TJ going to Cloud9, like even TJ, I don't really like he is a veteran, but I don't view him as like that outspoken type of veteran person. So really outside of Slasher, I don't know if there's anyone Cloud9 will be targeting this offseason who has that sort of like uh ability to like, have that sort of conversation with Jack about what the team needs to do um once they actually are formed and any like actual important decisions of where they compete from. So I do think the whole if this team decides if C9's sticking in Cali and they're going to compete online, obviously it seems like online Call of Duty is here to stay. We always talk about that. That definitely is a factor that some of these um, teams are going to have to consider. But I mean, just thinking about it out loud, Slasher could be interesting. Even with the um, lack of results here at the end of the season, Slasher is a Cali kid. Um, maybe he goes and joins Cloud9 for a season and then hangs it up after that. I don't know. That's something interesting entirely too. Who knows if Slasher even competes beyond this year? But just thinking about it right now while I'm talking, that could be an interesting route Cloud9 goes down, but we got some time. I do think with this team that the Cali factor is massive in the offseason, but I do think, depending on how this team does at EWC, that could have a big impact as to what they do in the offseason.
Yeah, I was also thinking Kenny because he's not from Cali, but he lived
Yeah.
in Cali and LA specifically for a long time.
Yep.
So
That's a good
might
show.
be interesting to watch out. Speaking of Kenny, though, Minnesota ROKKR, ninth place this year. They had a shot at the end of the year to make it to champs. I want to get to it in a minute, but there's a reason why they're not at champs. 165 points on the season, 15 and 24 in matches, 39% win percentage, 72 and 93 in terms of maps, which is 44 map win percentage. Um, let's talk about it because it is kind of like the biggest reason that they're not at champs this season. Game 5 record. They were the team that I actually started with, and then I did it for everyone else. So, like, just to give you an idea of what the Game 5 records is, I said at the beginning, Vegas 2-3 on the year, LAG 2-7 on the year, not great. C9 3-6 on the year. Minnesota ROKKR 8-9, 17 Game 5s on this season. 17 of their 39 matches were Game 5s. They lose 9 of them. I should mention also they won 4 to start the season, so they were 4-0
Yeah.
in Game 5s at one point, and then they went 4-9 the rest of the way. I think they finished 35 points behind Boston for 8th place, so they basically needed 4 more wins. There's a lot, I'm sure they could look back at just the Game 5s that they had, the 9 losses that they had and said, like, could we have gotten 4 just from that alone? And I'm sure they probably could. That just, to me, stuck out to have that many to go to Game 5. There probably were series that did not need to go to a 5th game, and they just weren't able to pull it out. They were at their best in Search and Destroy this year, but they weren't necessarily. There wasn't like one that was just a game mode that was so much worse than the rest. Their worst game mode was Hardpoint, but they were 40%, which is not as bad as you would imagine, considering them being in the bottom 4. But yeah, this is a. They have an interesting offseason because they had an interesting offseason last year. They resulted in Estriel, Geo, and Nero and Paul X coming into the team. We talked about so much at the beginning of the season. Did they have the leadership to make a run? It seemed like a lot of young guys that did not have like the vocal, I guess, veteran leadership that we usually expect of these rosters. I don't know if that really played out the way that we thought it would, but now that they brought Kenny in, that would seem to kind of resolve that. Where do you think Minnesota should or will go from here?
Yeah, I think Minnesota can go in a lot of directions. I think obviously after not making champs, they are going to make changes unless they just go on a, bonkers run at EWC. And I wouldn't put it past them just because like you mentioned they had that game 5 success early on in the season. Let's not forget like they were consistently reverse sweeping teams, and if they weren't reverse sweeping, they were going down 2-0 in series and forcing a game 5, and then they were losing that game 5. That plays a factor into how many game 5s they had, and I just remember mentioning early on, like you were talking about with the leadership and stuff, it definitely felt like that was lacking early on. But I remember saying like so many of their matches were going to game 5. This was going to be important for them as the season went on, just because they're getting maximum reps. They're getting the like, if they get in these situations at majors, like where they're down 2-0 in a series, they were the team that was consistently fighting back. And if it got to that point at champs where they were down 2-0, just for example, obviously they're not, but like they had the reps to be like, okay, we've been here before. We know we can pull off a reverse sweep. We just got to kick it into another gear and do what we did earlier in the season. They knew what they could do, and they had pulled off reverse sweeps. They had the game 5 wins, but it's just consistency really is the key word with this Minnesota team all year. Um, they had, really that core 3 of Estriel, Geo, and Nero. They all had some really great performances individually, and it just felt like the 3 of them never clicked at the same time. It felt like, especially most recently at Major 4, and obviously early on in the season at numerous times, but at Major 4, from the matches I watched, I remember like Nero was absolutely popping off. And, when somebody is just going nuclear to that level, it makes sense that the kill numbers are going to be a little, there's going to be a disparity there because, as we always say, there are only so many kills you can get on the map. But it just felt like to me, like even I feel like in major two qualifiers was when Estriel really kicked it into another gear for this team and really started to shine. But just as a whole, it felt like of that core three, there was never there just wasn't a ton of consistency from all three of them performing at a high level at the same time. It was always either one or two of them really playing well, and then somebody was lacking, or like one player of the three was doing well, the other two weren't playing as well, and that's when the losses were coming. So to me, that's like the indicator that Minnesota did a really good job identifying this talent. I think Estriel, Gio, and Nero are all really strong players individually, and I think all three will be in the CDL next year. I just think this has shown that it doesn't work together as this core, and maybe it's just they haven't had enough time since bringing in Kenny, and maybe they decide to run it back next year because you think from a contractual standpoint, like those three guys, at least Estriel, Gio, and Nero, probably signed their deals. Well, there is no more league minimum, but they probably weren't like super expensive contract wise, if I had to guess. Nero there was that thing early in the offseason last year where like Nero potentially was going to go to Cloud9, but then they decided to go with Mac, and that's when Nero went to Minnesota. So maybe Nero gets some options from other teams here and there. But for me, with this Minnesota squad, I if you watch the show this year, how much it pains me to say that I think they're going to break up, because I saw the potential. I really like this squad. I just think from a consistency standpoint, it just wasn't able to work on a consistent basis. And I think Minnesota, end of the day, unless they just go on an absolutely bonkers run at EWC, I think they're going to blow it up. But I don't think, from GentleMates and Cloud9 perspective, I think just completely move on and start fresh. I think here with Minnesota, they pick either one of Estriel, Gio, or Nero. And I mean, they could even pick two, I guess, end of the day. But I think they have the foundational pieces there in either one or two of those guys, and then they build something different just because, they didn't get the champ, so they got to do something different. But I just don't know that if it was me right now, I really like Nero and Gio. I think I would build around Estriel. I think he showed the potential this year. To just be a really solid foundational piece. And it was really like last year there was that chatter at the end of the year in the rookie of the year race where it felt like it was like a runaway for Gwyn, and even if you didn't think it was a runaway, it was like Gwyn and Abuza. But there were those people in the community who were like, why is Estriel not getting mentioned enough here? And I think for those people, this year was like kind of certification of that. Like he showed a lot of more potential this year, I feel like, and especially from a statistical standpoint. So I think I would build around Estriel this current squad, but I mean I could sit here for a while and talk about why I think you could build a solid squad around Estriel, why you could build a solid squad around Gio, why you could build a solid squad around Nero, or any combination of those two. So Minnesota definitely has some options in the offseason. But I do think, that I've been high on Minnesota throughout this year. Maybe I'm still on that copium right now for EWC, but if they go on a good run at EWC, maybe they decide to run the squad back in entirety. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's probably a mistake. It feels like um, just getting kind of caught up in the end of the result or the end result and thinking that it's gonna work out next season. Unless you feel like you're like a Boston kind of situation where it's not really about competing for like a championship. It's more just about getting to champs, and that's kind of like the end goal, because then you probably could run it back with these four and just kind of convince yourself that our team chemistry will kind of be the deciding factor with some of those other teams. Um, but yeah, I was trying to look it up while you're talking. I can't find it. I don't know what episode we talked about it, but it was at the beginning of the season or before the season. We talked about how one of these players needed to step up and become like a next level kind of player in order for Minnesota to have more success than just being kind of a middle of the road team. And that didn't happen. Like you can make it, like you said, each of them had these moments, right, where they looked like, oh, this is, they're kind of taking a leap, but neither or none of these four players, but specifically the three players that started and finished the season with Minnesota, none of them turned out to be the superstar that you typically need to win champs and to be like a true championship contender. And maybe they were never meant to be that, but that does make it really, really difficult when you go into an off season and you're like, you can talk yourself into any of these three players remaining on the roster into next season. Kenny is also an interesting case because I thought it was a risk to pick him up when they
Yeah.
did, because his stock had never been lower in his professional career. So, he definitely had a better time with Minnesota than he did with Optic, which was an interesting development. That being said, I don't know if he's going to be the guy next year, but if they were to build it, take this team and say, we're going to take Estriel and Kenny, and we're going to try to, get some really good talent in here next year that maybe fit around Estriel specifically, maybe that is the key to success for Minnesota. I just think it's a really difficult decision because, like you mentioned, like Estro, Gio, or Nero, any one of them could break out and be, the guy that you build around. But I don't know if there is. I also don't think if Minnesota. I don't know if Minnesota can actually get the big free agent, or if they have the G2 backing, so they have this very well organized organization, but at the same point, like, can they get the player that they're going to need to win championships? That feels like probably not, like, especially with Atlanta and LAT and Optic all kind of looming in the top three. So maybe the Toronto guys. I think, like, we'll see what happens with the Ultra, but I'm sure if they picked up Kleenex, you're all on board with Minnesota. I think if, Insight the same way, like, who knows? Joe Deceives has had a really, really good season this year. Could Minnesota be able to get Joe on their team and then build around him? I just think they have a lot of interesting ways to look at their offseason. I just don't know if they're going to actually have a successful offseason as a result of that.
I do think it is just to put a bow on it. Even though it was just like less than 5 minutes ago, I forget exactly how you just phrased it, but like the conversation around like championship contending or whatever with this Minnesota squad, that really, like, heading into this season, it was kind of like similar with Carolina. Like, I don't think either of us had very high expectations for this team. At least as a team, I definitely remember saying like I was excited about some of the, really it was Gio and Nero at the start of the season for me, or before the season even started. And then Estriel played very well and started to grow on me very much as the season went on. But yeah, like heading into the season, that really wasn't like a thing. But just the fact that even for a team that didn't make it to champs, like, it's like that this squad has the potential to maybe like get to a championship Sunday or something, and it just wasn't realized. Like, that's an interesting tidbit in itself, and like maybe like that moves the benchmarks for exactly what this Minnesota team is trying to do in the offseason.
And just to kind of put a bow on it to make it official, so your keeper cut is keep Estriel, and we'll include Looney in this as well.
Yeah, like Looney. Like I said, I mean, I could sit here for a while and talk about really all three of the. I mean, you brought up an interesting point with like maybe it's one of the core three plus Kenny to keep and then cut the other two. I think Gio and Nero are going to get some offers from some other teams, and maybe they decide to go elsewhere. I mean, Estriel could too for all that. So I think right now, if I was the GM, I would be trying to find a way to keep two of the core three, whichever two I thought were the best in terms of working together and whatnot. And then getting two guys to piece around them. But if I had to make something right now, I would want to keep Estriel and see what I can build around him.
Yeah, I'm probably keeping Estrio and Geo, and then trying to figure out the other two. But again, this is they have a good problem in that they have good young players, but they can't run it back just as is unless they're just content with finishing, somewhere between 6 and 8, and maybe even not that, considering
this,
yeah. So so they went 6 and 10 with Kenny in this lineup. So like I don't know what that would turn out to be over a full season if they would be able to beat Boston, but it obviously didn't work out, and they'll have a long offseason ahead of them. One last question before we get out of here. Of these 4 teams, which situation do you think is the best to turn around for next season? If you're a GM, let's say, and you get your pick, you get offered from Vegas, you get offered with LAG, C9, and Minnesota, which of those are the most attractive to try to compete for next year?
Man, I definitely don't think I'm going with GentleMates or Cloud9. I think it's got to be Vegas or Minnesota for me. Vegas is interesting because of Pred. Like, if he has already signed a deal beyond just this season, like that's like going to a team with KD or Giannis or something, and they're already there, and then you got to put the pieces. It's much easier to do that when you have that superstar there, and then you build around that. But Minnesota would be an exciting project for me. I would be torn between what exactly I want to do, and obviously there are other factors and options that weigh into it. It could be a situation where I say Minnesota here, and none of the core 3 of Estriel, G or Nero is on Minnesota next year, right? But if Pred already has a deal with Vegas beyond this season, that becomes the most interesting option to me.
Yeah, I think I go with Vegas as well, because you're thinking if we can retain one of these players, or if I think in the situation for all 4 of these teams, it's like you have the option of running it back for all 4 of these teams, even if that isn't really the case. But that in our scenario, you have that option of keeping any of these players and all of these players. If that's the case, Vegas has to be the most attractive in my eyes, because they have the star player that Minnesota is lacking. Minnesota is looking for that guy to be like the undoubtedly best player over a course of a season. So Vegas has that. They could add around him, even with the restriction of having the Saudi representation. I think they could still build a pretty interesting team next year. And if they're willing to spend the money, then they have, pretty wide opportunities to make that team into something very, very interesting. So, but we'll see what happens with all these teams going into this offseason. Esports World Cup, I believe, is middle or late July, if I'm not mistaken. So that could be the first sign of what these teams might look like next season. Yeah, so Esports World Cup starts for the Call of Duty event, starts July 24th. So almost 2 months from now.
Yeah.
These teams some of them will certainly make changes, I'm sure of that, because that's a good first test for a lot of the teams. If they were to change a roster, hey, let's see what they look like on LAN immediately against some pretty good teams. We saw Boston, they stuck with their EWC roster this entire season, and they were the worst team in the CDL last year, and they ended up making champs this year. So there is some kind of proof that EWC can be very beneficial to these teams as we move forward. But yeah, that does it for today's episode. This has been a long one, nearly an hour and a half, but we appreciate you guys sticking around and having a lot of fun with it. We will be back probably over the weekend, maybe, to talk about, I think we're probably going to do tier lists, or we're going to do award shows. It's one or the other for next episode. We Either way, those will be the next 2 episodes if that's not clear. And then we'll probably shift gears and start talking about champs a little bit after that. But we appreciate you guys sticking around and watching or listening to the show. Make sure to like or subscribe wherever you're listening or watching on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube. We're on most, if not all, of the platforms. Please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Leave a nice review if you could. I believe you can also leave a review, or you definitely can rate us on Spotify as well. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Search up Ego Chall Podcast on YouTube. We're at 234 subscribers the last time I checked on YouTube. You can also follow us on Twitch, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. You can also follow Bink on Twitch, twitch.tv/JBink with 2Ks. On Twitter, he is at JBink with 2Ks. I'm at Pres Byers, and the podcast Twitter's at Ego Chall Podcast. And we will be back over the weekend to talk about more Call of Duty esports. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys, as always, for all the support. Definitely a longer episode, especially considering the subject matter here. But I had a good time talking about these teams, even if they are the teams that won't be at champs. That doesn't mean we can't, discuss them, what happened this season, and what they can do differently going forward. So I hope you guys enjoyed. We'll see you back here again whenever we do go live once again. And remember to send the chow.